Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been here before, it's good to have you again. And today we are going to look at something that feels simple at first, but gets harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. Someone loses money in a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and they tell themselves it was just bad timing or something outside their control. But a while later, it happens again in a slightly different form, and then again, until the pattern starts to feel familiar in a way they cannot explain. A relationship ends, and they say the other person was the problem. But when the next relationship follows the same path and breaks in the same place, the explanation starts to feel weaker, even if they do not want to admit it yet. At some point, a quiet realization begins to surface, and it does not come from one event, but from the repetition itself. What if this is not something that keeps happening to them? What if, without fully seeing it, they are the one choosing the same direction every time? There is a person who does not think of their life as a pattern, and if you asked them directly, they would probably say that things just have not worked out the way they hoped, and that most of what has happened came from circumstances they could not fully control. A few years ago, they made a financial decision that felt like a chance to move forward. And at the time, it seemed reasonable, even necessary, but it ended in a loss that took longer to recover from than they expected. And they told themselves it was just one of those moments where timing was wrong and the situation was unpredictable. Later, another opportunity came. And even though it looked different on the surface, something about it felt familiar in a way they could not quite define. But they moved forward again, trusting that this time it would lead somewhere better. And once again, the result was almost the same. Not identical in detail, but close enough in outcome that it left the same kind of impact. In their relationships, a similar pattern appears, even if they do not recognize it immediately. Because each person they meet seems different at first, with different personalities and different situations. But over time, the same tension builds, the same misunderstandings repeat, and the ending follows a path that feels strangely predictable. After each situation, they take time to reflect, and they can point to specific reasons why things did not work, focusing on the other person, the timing, or the pressure they were under. And each explanation makes sense on its own, which makes it easier to move on without questioning anything deeper. From their point of view, these are separate events, each with its own story and its own explanation, and there is no clear reason to connect them, because doing so would require looking at something they have not yet considered. But if someone else were to step back and look at the same sequence from a distance, they would start to notice that while the details change, the structure does not, and that each situation begins with a similar kind of decision, made under similar internal conditions, leading toward a similar kind of outcome. The person is not unaware, but they are not fully aware either, because what they see are events, while what they do not yet see is the pattern that connects them. And as long as each moment is treated as isolated, there is no reason to question the choices behind it. And so, life continues forward in the same direction, not because of a single mistake, but because of a series of decisions that feel independent, even though they are quietly aligned in a way that has not yet been recognized. If we slow things down and look at these situations side by side, something begins to stand out, and it is not the surface details, but the structure underneath, because each decision follows a similar path, even when it appears different at first. In the financial case, the first choice was made with a mix of pressure and hope, where the person felt the need to act quickly while also believing that this decision could finally move things forward. And when the outcome failed, it was explained as bad timing rather than a reflection of how the decision was made. When the second opportunity appeared, the conditions were not identical, but the internal state was, because the same mix of urgency and expectation was present, leading to another decision that felt justified in the moment, but followed the same direction as before. And once again, the result echoed the earlier outcome. In relationships, the pattern is even harder to see because emotions are involved, but the structure remains consistent. Since the person is drawn to a certain type of dynamic, responds in a familiar way when tension appears, and stays in the situation longer than they should, even when the signs are already clear. Each relationship feels unique while it is happening, but when placed next to each other, the similarities become difficult to ignore, because the same triggers appear, the same responses follow, and the same ending unfolds with small variations that do not change the overall direction. What makes this pattern harder to recognize is that the person is not making identical choices in a literal sense, but they are making equivalent choices in terms of direction, meaning that even when the context changes, the underlying decision process stays the same. It is not about choosing the same job, the same investment, or the same partner, but about choosing from the same internal position, reacting to situations in the same way, and moving toward outcomes that are aligned with that pattern, even if it is not intentional. Over time, this creates a sequence where different events begin to produce similar results, not because life is repeating itself randomly, but because the decisions guiding those events are consistent in a way that has not been fully examined. Once this becomes visible, the idea of coincidence starts to lose its strength, because repetition at this level suggests something more stable than chance, something that continues across situations without needing the same external conditions to exist. And this is the point where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, because it is no longer about what happened in one moment, but about how a series of choices, made over time, have quietly led to the same place again and again. At this point, something starts to feel uncomfortable, not because the events are new, but because the pattern behind them is becoming harder to ignore. And this creates a tension that is not external but internal, because it challenges the way the person has been understanding their own life. From their perspective, life has been a series of situations that did not go as planned, and each time something went wrong, there were clear reasons that explained it. Whether it was timing, other people, or unexpected changes, and those explanations were enough to move forward without questioning anything deeper. But now, when the same type of outcome appears again, those explanations start to lose some of their strength, not because they are completely wrong, but because they are no longer complete, and something is missing that cannot be explained by circumstances alone. The person still feels like life is happening to them, and that feeling does not disappear easily because it has been reinforced over time, and it is supported by real events that did not go in their favor, which makes it difficult to step back and see another possibility. At the same time, the evidence is beginning to point in a different direction, because when multiple situations lead to similar outcomes through similar decisions, it becomes harder to separate what happened from how it was chosen, even if that connection is not fully clear yet. This creates a quiet contradiction that sits beneath the surface, where two ideas exist at the same time without fully resolving, because on one side, the person believes they are reacting to life, while on the other side, the pattern suggests they are actively shaping the direction through their choices. The tension does not come from a single realization, but from the accumulation of moments that begin to align in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. And each new repetition adds more weight to the possibility that something deeper is happening. There is also a resistance to accepting this, because recognizing the pattern would mean looking at personal responsibility in a way that feels heavier than before, and it would require questioning decisions that once felt justified, which is not an easy shift to make. So the mind moves between two positions, trying to hold on to the idea that things are mostly outside of control, while also noticing that the outcomes are not as random as they once seemed. And this back and forth creates a kind of pressure that does not resolve on its own. And this is where the question becomes unavoidable, not as a conclusion, but as a tension that keeps returning. Because if the same choices keep leading to the same place, then the problem may not be in what is happening, but in how those choices are being made. At this point, instead of trying to force a conclusion, it helps to step into a different perspective. Not as a replacement for what we see, but as another way to interpret the same pattern. And this is where Edgar Cayce's readings offer a useful reframe that shifts the focus from events to continuity. In Cayce's view, choices are not isolated moments that disappear once they are made, but part of an ongoing process that continues shaping a person's direction over time, meaning that what we decide does not end with the immediate outcome, but carries forward as a tendency that influences future decisions. This idea suggests that a choice is not just something you make once, but something you begin. Because once a certain direction is taken, it becomes easier to take it again. Not because of external pressure, but because the internal path has already been established in a way that feels familiar and justified. According to Cayce, this continuity does not stop at the boundaries of a single lifetime, because the patterns formed through repeated decisions can extend beyond one life and reappear in another, not as exact repetitions of events, but as similar tendencies that guide behavior in consistent ways. This does not mean that a person is trapped in a fixed outcome, but it does suggest that the starting point of their decisions may already be influenced by patterns they are not fully aware of, which can make certain choices feel natural, even when they lead to the same results. From this perspective, the repetition we see is not random and not purely situational, but connected to a deeper layer of continuity, where the way a person chooses becomes more important than the specific situation they are in, because the same internal position can produce similar outcomes across very different circumstances. Cayce's readings often describe this as a kind of momentum, where past choices create a direction that continues forward until it is consciously recognized and changed. And until that happens, the pattern can repeat without the person clearly understanding why it keeps returning. What makes this perspective different is that it does not focus on blaming the individual for their outcomes, but on recognizing the role of continuity in shaping those outcomes, which shifts the question from "Why did this happen?" to "What pattern is being continued here?" This reframe also removes the idea that each event needs to be explained on its own, because instead of looking at isolated situations, it encourages looking at the sequence as a whole, where meaning is not found in one moment, but in the pattern that connects them over time. Seen this way, the person is not just experiencing repeated outcomes, but participating in a process that they are continuing through their decisions, even if that process began long before they became aware of it, and even if it extends further than they can currently see. And this leads to a different kind of question, one that does not focus on what went wrong in a single situation, but on what direction has been carried forward through multiple choices, shaping a path that feels familiar because it has been followed more than once. When we move beyond a single person and begin to look at multiple lives side by side, the pattern becomes easier to recognize, not because the situations are identical, but because the structure of decision-making repeats in ways that are difficult to ignore once you see it clearly. In financial situations, one person may repeatedly enter opportunities that promise quick improvement, and even though each case looks different on the surface, the underlying decision often comes from the same place, where urgency combines with expectation, leading them to act before fully stepping back. And the result tends to follow a similar path regardless of the specific details involved. Another person may avoid risk completely, choosing stability even when growth is possible. And over time, this creates a different pattern, where the outcome is not loss through action, but limitation through inaction. Yet the structure is still the same, because the decision comes from a consistent internal position that repeats across situations. In relationships, The pattern can take many forms, but the mechanism remains stable because one person may consistently choose partners who require them to give more than they receive, while another may pull away whenever things begin to deepen. And in both cases, the surface story changes while the underlying direction stays the same. What connects these cases is not the type of outcome, but the repetition of a decision style, where the person approaches situations from a familiar internal state, responds in predictable ways when certain triggers appear, and moves toward outcomes that align with that pattern even when the context is new. This is why two people can live very different lives on the outside and still follow a similar pattern underneath, because the external details are less important than the way decisions are made. And once that way becomes consistent, the results begin to echo each other over time. It is also why changing the situation alone often does not change the outcome, because if the internal decision process remains the same, the new context will eventually produce a familiar result, even if it takes time for the pattern to reveal itself again. From this perspective, repetition is not about copying the same event, but about continuing the same approach. And as long as that approach stays in place, the variation in circumstances only changes how the pattern looks, not where it leads. This becomes clearer when we compare these patterns across different areas of life, because the same person who repeats financial decisions may also show a similar structure in relationships or career choices, even if the connection is not obvious at first, since the core is not the situation itself, but the way they move through it. Over time, this creates a kind of consistency that can feel confusing from the inside, because each event seems separate, but from the outside, it forms a sequence that points in a clear direction, shaped by decisions that are similar in nature, even when they appear different in form. And once we see this across multiple people and multiple contexts, the idea becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence, because the repetition is not tied to one life story, but appears wherever the same decision patterns are present, continuing forward until something changes at the level where those decisions begin. If we set aside the idea of past lives for a moment and look at the same pattern through modern psychology, we begin to see a similar structure explained in a different language, one that focuses on behavior, habit, and the way the mind processes decisions over time. In psychology, repeated outcomes are often linked to behavioral loops, where a person responds to certain situations in consistent ways because those responses have been reinforced through past experiences. And once a loop is established, it can operate without conscious awareness, guiding decisions in ways that feel natural but are not always examined. This loop usually begins with a trigger, which can be external or internal, followed by a familiar response, and then an outcome that reinforces the pattern, even if that outcome is not positive, because the sense of familiarity itself can act as a form of reinforcement that keeps the loop active. Over time, these loops become more stable, not because they are correct, but because they are repeated, and repetition creates a kind of efficiency in the brain, allowing decisions to be made quickly without going through a full process of evaluation each time. This is why a person can find themselves making similar choices in different situations without realizing it, because the decision does not feel like a repeated action, but like a natural response to the current moment, even though it follows a pattern that has already been established. Another concept that supports this is subconscious decision-making, where much of what we choose is influenced by underlying beliefs and emotional conditioning that we are not fully aware of. And these internal factors can shape our perception of what feels right or necessary in a given situation. For example, someone who has learned to associate urgency with opportunity may feel compelled to act quickly whenever a chance appears, while someone who associates closeness with risk may begin to withdraw when relationships deepen. And in both cases, the decision feels justified because it aligns with an internal framework that has been built over time. Pattern recognition also plays a role, because the mind tends to look for familiar structures and repeat known paths, especially when those paths have been used before, even if the outcomes were not ideal, since familiarity often feels safer than uncertainty. From this perspective, the repetition we see is not mysterious, but a result of how the mind organizes experience and simplifies decision-making, creating patterns that continue until they are brought into awareness and consciously adjusted. What makes this connection important is that it does not contradict Cayce's perspective, but rather aligns with it in a different form, because both views point to the idea that choices are not isolated, and that patterns continue over time through mechanisms that are not always visible at the surface level. Whether we describe it as continuity across lifetimes or as behavioral loops shaped by experience, the underlying principle remains consistent, because in both cases, the direction of a person's life is influenced by patterns of decision-making that repeat until they are recognized and changed. And this brings us to a point where the question is no longer whether patterns exist, but how deeply they are embedded, and how much of what we call circumstance is actually connected to the way those patterns continue to guide our choices over time. At this point, the idea begins to settle into something clearer, not as a theory, but as a way to understand what has already been observed. Because when patterns repeat across time, situations, and even different areas of life, it becomes difficult to see choices as isolated moments that disappear once they are made. A choice does not end when the result appears, because even after the outcome is experienced, the direction behind that choice can remain active, shaping how the next decision is approached. And in that sense, a person is not just dealing with the consequences of what they chose, but continuing the path that choice created. This is why the same type of outcome can appear again without the person intending it, because the decision is not being made from a neutral position, but from a direction that has already been formed through previous choices, which makes certain responses feel more natural than others. Over time, this creates a continuity where decisions begin to build on each other, forming a structure that influences behavior in a consistent way. And as that structure becomes more stable, it starts to define not just what a person does, but how they tend to act across different situations. In this sense, identity is not only shaped by what has happened, but by how a person repeatedly chooses to respond, because those repeated responses form patterns that become part of how they move through the world, often without needing to think about each decision in detail. This also explains why change can feel difficult, even when a person clearly sees the outcome they want to avoid, because recognizing the result is not the same as changing the direction that leads to it. And without addressing that underlying direction, the same pattern can continue in a new form. What this points to is a simple but often overlooked idea that you do not just live with your choices as something in the past, but you carry them forward as something that continues, influencing how you see situations, how you respond to them, and ultimately where those responses lead. And if that is the case, then the focus shifts from trying to control outcomes to understanding the direction of decision-making itself. Because it is not the event that repeats, but the way of choosing that produces similar results across different contexts. Seen this way, a person's life is not shaped only by what happens to them, but by the continuity of how they choose, and that continuity can remain invisible until it is examined directly, at which point the pattern that once felt like circumstance begins to reveal itself as something more consistent and more personal. At this point, it becomes less about the person in the story and more about something closer, because once a pattern is clearly seen, it is difficult not to recognize parts of it in our own lives, even if the details are different on the surface. Think about a situation that has repeated for you, not necessarily in the same form, but in the same direction, where the outcome feels familiar even when the circumstances change. and where the explanation always seems to focus on what happened rather than how the decision was made. It could be something small that you usually ignore, or something more significant that has shaped important parts of your life. But in both cases, the question is not about judging the outcome, but about looking at the path that led there more than once. When you look at that sequence, ask yourself what tends to happen just before the decision is made, because there is often a moment where the same internal state appears, whether it is urgency, hesitation, expectation, or a need to avoid something. And that moment can repeat even when the situation changes. Then consider how you usually respond in that moment. Not in theory, but in practice. Because the pattern is not defined by what you intend to do, but by what you actually do when the situation unfolds. And that response may be more consistent than it first appears. If the same type of response has appeared more than once, leading towards similar outcomes, then it may not be enough to focus only on changing the result, because the direction that leads to that result is still in place, waiting for the next situation where it can express itself again. This is where the question becomes more direct, because instead of asking why something keeps happening, it shifts toward asking what is being continued through the way you choose, even when each situation feels separate at the time. And this is not about placing blame or reducing everything to a single explanation, but about recognizing that patterns often exist at a level that is easy to overlook, especially when each moment is treated as isolated from the ones that came before it. So the reflection becomes simple, but not always easy, because it requires looking at repetition without immediately explaining it away, and allowing the possibility that the connection between these moments may be closer than it first seemed. If your choices have led you to the same place more than once, even in different forms, then the question is no longer just about what happened, but about what direction has been followed through those choices, and whether that direction is still being continued right now. If there is one thing to take from this, it is not a final answer, but a shift in how you look at your own experience. Because once you begin to see patterns in your decisions, it becomes harder to explain everything as random or outside of your control, even if the situations themselves are complex. The goal is not to analyze every detail or to question every choice, but to notice when something repeats in a way that feels familiar, and to pause long enough to ask whether the direction behind that choice has already been followed before. Because if patterns are formed through repeated decisions, then change does not begin with the outcome, but with the moment where a different direction is chosen, even if that moment is small and easy to overlook at first. If this made you think about something in your own life, feel free to share it in the comments, especially if there is a pattern you have started to notice or a question that still does not feel fully answered. And if you want to explore more stories like this, you can like the video or subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives so you do not miss the next one.